if we don't understand the political context, we're going to have a less than holistic understanding of the history of the church.
Government exists to protect the liberties of all citizens.
Having now seen firsthand, Joseph Smith felt like he needed to act.
The persecution of the Latter-day Saints influenced Joseph's political views, particularly his belief that the federal government had failed.
But that's the moment where Joseph decided to run for President of the United States.
The big discomfort people might have with Joseph Smith's presidential campaign is this fusion of church and state.
Joseph Smith was the first U.S. presidential candidate to be assassinated.
There were no consequences for killing Joseph Smith. There was a murder trial held, but nobody was convicted, and basically nothing happened to the people that carried out the murders.
So was there political motivation in the martyrdom of Joseph Smith?
If he hadn't been killed in Carthage jail, could he have won the presidency?
What? Let's talk about that. Hello, Casey.
Hello, Scott. How are you doing?
Good, man. We are back and ready to roll today.
Yeah, and this is sort of episode 2, I guess. I'm saying with a little question mark, because a couple weeks ago, we sort of did episode 1 of this new series, but we timed it to go with the planned fifth Sunday, where the first presidency had asked everybody to talk about the Constitution of the United States because it's the 250th birthday of America. So how you taught the fifth Sunday in your ward, right, Scott?
Well, I thought I was going to, but my good bishop said, I got it. Why don't you just chime in? So I was like, oh, okay. So right. I lied on this podcast, Casey. I said in that episode that I was going to teach, and then I showed up and Bishop got it. So I was like, okay, I will defer to him. And he did a great job, actually. In fact, I wish I would have watched President Christopherson and Elder Cook's video before we had our conversation, because he played that in that fifth Sunday, and it was superb. It's President Christopherson and Elder Cook talking about the Constitution together for like 20 minutes. And kind of, it was unscripted, it was off the cuff, and it was just rich and good and beautiful. So if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend go check out President Christopherson and Elder Cook discussing the Constitution. It was so good. So
yeah, it's right in Gospel Library. And same thing. I showed an excerpt from their video. I didn't want to show a 20-minute video, but I agree with you. The discussion was really excellent, and everybody should take a look at it. And I want to specify, the only reason why I didn't show the full 22-minute video is I got a little surprised, which I thought I was teaching the adults, but the bishopric in our ward decided to have just everybody come in and sit in on the lesson. And when I say everybody, it was the adults, the youth, and the bishopric even taught the primary so that the primary teachers could come. And so it was a full house. And when I found out I was going to have teenagers there, I actually sort of adjusted things. But some of the teenagers made some of the best comments about the Constitution and religious liberty. All I'm saying is the kids are all right. So I came away super impressed with the youth in the Harvest Hills 9th Ward. They are outstanding, and I really appreciated what the adults had to say, too. We had a great discussion, because I was a little worried it was going to go off the rails anytime you talk about politics. It seems like it gets a little scary, but we had a delightful discussion, and it was one of the best experiences I've had.
Awesome. Shout out to the youth of the Harvest Hills 9th Ward, did you say?
9th Ward, yes.
Yeah. We're kind of tongue-in-cheek calling this our religion and politics series, you know. It's what you can't talk about in polite company and at Thanksgiving and Christmas. But honestly, we feel like this is such an important topic. There is so much rich history here starting all the way back at the beginning with Joseph Smith and the first generation of saints. And so we did get to talk about the U.S. Constitution and Joseph Smith's views on that. And we did that in our last episode of this series, our pre-launch first episode. And so we want to continue that conversation today. And we're talking about something super cool, actually, something really fascinating. Yeah,
and I should mention, too, that this series is going to be episodic, meaning we're not covering the entire history of the church and politics. So there's not going to be a day where we go through like the Senate tenure of Orrin Hatch or something like that. We've selected specific episodes that we think are really illustrative, that kind of help us understand how the church got to where it is, and how politics have kind of been a factor in that. Because we've emphasized from the beginning, this story, the story of the restoration, does not take place in a vacuum. So understanding politics is part of understanding the story of how the gospel has unfolded in the latter days. And that's all we're trying to do.
Yeah, 100%. Last year, we harped on the 4 C's, right? We got to have the context before we understand the content. And then we can better understand the controversies. And then we can better understand the consequences that flow from all of that. And I think that fits pretty well here, that if we don't understand the political context of the background of what was happening in the U.S. and how that affected the Latter-day Saints in the first generation and on, we're going to have a less than holistic understanding of the history of the church, because it is definitely affected by what happens politically, and our interactions are not always pleasant with the government. But there are some spots of sunshine, and so we want to talk about all of it in this series. That, like you said, it's not going to be comprehensive, but it is going to hit some of the ones that we feel like are maybe most consequential to understand. If you understand the context, then you'll better understand our church's history, right? That's kind of how we're selecting what to talk about.
Yeah, it's episodic. So let's quickly summarize episode 1. Since it was a couple weeks ago, we went back and talked about the word of wisdom for a couple weeks. First, the revelations given in the Doctrine and Covenants about the American Constitution came in the context of the severe persecutions that the church suffered in Missouri in the 1830s. And in the Revelations, the Lord instructed the saints to seek legal means to try and redress the wrongs that were inflicted on them.
Yeah, the Revelations state that the Constitution was written by men that were raised up by the Lord for that purpose, and that the rights and privileges in the Constitution belong to all mankind, not just Americans.
Mm-hmm. And yet, in that very same revelation, the Lord clarifies that the Constitution isn't perfect. In fact, he condemned one tenet of the Constitution of the time, saying it is not right that one man should be in bondage one to another. And he asked the saints to uphold the parts of the Constitution that aligned with just and holy principles. Those are the words, the exact words from the Revelation.
Yeah. Constitution is meant to be a living document, right, that can be updated. And that slavery issue was one that needed to be updated. He highlights that right there in section 101. But just because the Constitution is flawed doesn't mean that it isn't vital to God's purposes, right? In one statement that we shared, Joseph Smith bore his testimony of the Constitution, saying that it was true in the same sentence where he said that the Bible was true, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, God and Jesus Christ were true. So that's a pretty good endorsement of the Constitution.
Yeah. But Joseph Smith also had a few experiences that disillusioned him about the way the government was administering and applying the Constitution. And the most important one happened when Joseph and several other church leaders came face to face with the U.S. President Martin VanBuren. And when they presented their case about being forcibly ejected from the state of Missouri with loss of life, loss of property, and everything else that was involved in that, VanBuren reportedly said, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." VanBuren was apparently worried about losing the support of the state of Missouri in the upcoming election. And he was kind of the consummate politician who was willing to place a position and power over principle.
Yeah, and that moment of rejection by Martin VanBuren, and by Congress too, by the way, they petitioned them as well to none effect. That was really the inciting incident for what we're going to talk about today. Having now seen firsthand that our nation's leaders in Washington, D.C. were unwilling to use their positions of political power to act to protect its own citizens, right? In what should have been a pretty cut and dry case, by the way, where a minority religious group had been violently expelled from a U.S. state under the sanction of its governor, Joseph Smith felt like he needed to act. So with the encouragement of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in January 1844, we're going to talk all about this, but that's the moment where Joseph decided to run for President of the United States. So let's dive into that.
Yeah. And there's lots of questions about that campaign that we're going to try and answer today. For instance, what do we know about the particulars of the moment? What's the context of Joseph deciding to run for president? And who was he running against? And what was his political platform? And realistically, did he have any chance of winning? Those are all questions we're going to try and tackle here.
Did Joseph Smith have any chance of winning the presidential election? What a great question. So, okay, let's start with the basics here. And before we begin, actually, let's give a little shout out to some of our colleagues who've just done some great work, some scholars who've worked on Joseph Smith and his presidential campaign. The first I want to shout out is Spencer McBride. He wrote a book a few years ago titled Joseph Smith for President, The Prophet, the Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom. And as listeners of LDS podcasts, you might also know Spencer as the host of a few excellent series of podcasts produced by the Joseph Smith Papers team, which we highly recommend. You go check those out.
And the other scholar is Derek Sainsbury, who wrote a book called Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. And Derek's work focuses more on the missionaries that were sent all over the country to campaign for Joseph Smith. And these missionaries were teaching the gospel while they were also campaigning on behalf of Joseph Smith, which is sort of an unprecedented event in American history and in Latter-day Saint history.
So cool. Okay, so let's dig into that first question that we've already begun. What compelled Joseph Smith to run for president? We already mentioned some of the key context here was this trip to Washington, D.C., his disappointing encounters with Martin VanBuren and Congress. But, Casey, let me just ask you this. Were things really so bad that he didn't think any current or future political candidates would be able to help him and the saints?
The short answer is yes. So at first, after the Missouri expulsion, the Saints found refuge in Western Illinois in 1839, and they began to build the city of Nauvoo. But by the fall of 1843, several years later, the tides of persecution were beginning to rise again. And again, seeking help from the federal government, church leaders wrote to all of the major candidates for the upcoming 1844 U.S. presidential election. Each letter described the persecutions that the Saints had suffered at the hands of the state of Missouri, and then asked the pointed question, what will be your rule of action relative to us as a people? And they got several responses. So let's just go through the responses from each one.
Yeah, so this guy named Henry Clay, one of the presidential candidates there, he comes across as the most promising of the five who they sent those letters to, but he still stopped well short of a real commitment. Clay was the Whig candidate for the 1844 election, and here's what he told the Saints. He said that he would enter office free and unfettered, without making any specific promises beforehand. At the same time, though, he did express sympathy for the Saints' suffering, and he said they ought to enjoy the protection of the Constitution and U.S. laws like other religious communities. So in other words, Clay sounds friendly, yet he also seems pretty politically cautious. He does not reject the Latter-day Saints, but he also avoided tying himself to any sort of concrete rescue plan, right? He didn't want to commit himself. In other words, Clay is a politician.
Yeah.
He's presenting himself as sympathetic enough to keep the door open and win the Mormon votes, but vague enough so as not to ostracize those whose vote he would lose if he came out in open support of the Latter-day Saints, right? So the Saints understood that they're not going to really be able to rely on this guy.
Yeah. Clay's kind of like the consummate 19th century politician. And in American history, they talk a lot about how what Clay desperately wanted more than anything was to be president. And unfortunately, he never gets it. And it might be because, he was willing to make all these compromises everywhere along the way. So he's the most promising person. Martin VanBuren, who we've already mentioned.
Very promising.
Yeah, Martin VanBuren doesn't answer the letter at all. He actually was a leading contender for the Democratic nomination in 1844, and for a while he was considered the favorite, but he ultimately failed to secure the nomination because of one explosive issue that's going to pop up a lot through our conversation, and that's the annexation of Texas. He was opposed to it because he didn't want a war with Mexico, and he was worried about the entry of new slave states and how that might affect the Union. So no answer from Martin VanBuren.
Yeah, and Martin VanBuren's silence mattered a lot because Joseph Smith already had a bad history with him from his 1839 White House meeting, where, again, VanBuren said, and I'm quoting Joseph Smith on this one, quote, "Gentlemen, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. And if I take up for you, I shall lose the vote of Missouri." So there we go. There's another archetype of political politeness without action, right? His words are sympathetic, but he's unwilling to use federal power to help the saints. Why? Because he's afraid he's going to lose the vote of Missouri.
Now, another politician that the Saints reached out to was Lewis Cass. Cass was one of the major Democratic presidential hopefuls in the run-up to the 1844 election, though he ultimately doesn't win the nomination. And Cass replied more directly, but his answer was still a dead end for the Saints. He said the Saints should be protected in their rights like everyone else, which sounds good at first glance, but then he drew a hard line. If Missouri and Congress had already rejected the Saints' petitions, he did not see what power the president would have to interfere. So Cass recognized the injustice in principle, but he treated the Constitution as a system of limited federal power that could not reach inside a state's persecution of a minority. And for the Saints, this was basically a polite, no, I'm not going to do anything for you.
Finally, there was John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun was a huge advocate for slavery, and he was even more explicit in making states' rights the wall against federal help, actually. He said that if he was elected, that he would administer the government without religious distinction, which sounds promising for minority religious groups like the Latter-day Saints, but then he insisted that the Missouri case did not fall under federal jurisdiction because the federal government had only, quote, limited and specific powers, close quote. So Calhoun says, in effect, you guys have equal rights in theory, but you have no recourse for federal rescue in practice, right? And Joseph Smith was particularly perturbed by Calhoun's response because he's essentially claiming that a state could, legally, mob, expel, and impoverish a minority group while the national government just had to stand helplessly on the sidelines, powerless to interfere or to assist an innocent people.
Yeah. So let's summarize here. Clay was sympathetic but non-committal. VanBuren was cold and silent. He doesn't even answer. Cass acknowledged rights but denied federal power, and Calhoun defended equality in principle but not intervention in practice. And one other candidate, this is Richard M. Johnson, just really didn't answer. The collective failure on the part of the candidates for the upcoming presidential election is what pushed Joseph Smith and the Saints towards a kind of a jolting conclusion that Joseph Smith should throw his hat into the ring to be a presidential candidate. Yeah,
that is a jolt. It's like, wait, what? What just happened? Joseph Smith just said he's going to run for president of the United States. Like, what? Let's talk about that, right? So, yeah, with no satisfactory answer from any of the candidates, on January 29th, 1844, Joseph meets with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and a few others. And there, in that meeting, it was unanimously decided that Joseph Smith would run for president of the United States on an independent platform, by the way. He decides to run for president in 1844 because he and the Latter-day Saints had lost faith, essentially, that the existing American political institution would protect their rights. In fact, let me give a direct quote from Brother Joseph. He said this, quote, "I would not have suffered my name to have been used by my friends on any wise as President of the United States or candidate for that office, if I and my friends could have had the privilege of enjoying our religious and civil rights as American citizens, even those rights which the Constitution guarantees unto all her citizens alike. But this, as a people, we have been denied from the beginning," close quote. So there you go. His candidacy emerges out of repeated experiences of persecution, failed legal appeals, and frustration with this doctrine of states' rights and that the federal government can't intervene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that makes sense. Now that leads to a second question, which is, okay, what was Joseph Smith's platform for president? What was he going to do to try and remedy the situation?
Yeah, that's a lot easier to answer, more straightforward, because Joseph has a pamphlet published. It was issued in Nauvoo, and it's entitled General Smith's Views of the Powers and Policy of the Government. It's actually a really fun read. And as you catch to the beginning, it's called General Smith. Was Joseph Smith a general? Yes.
Yeah,
in the Nauvoo Legion.
Yeah,
in the Nauvoo Legion, he was the general of that. And so he leans into that title. He has a lot of titles, right? He could have leaned into mayor, obviously president of the church, prophet, but he went with general. General Smith's views of the powers and policy of the government. And this pamphlet is actually 12 pages long. It's extremely small, single-spaced print. So we're not going to promise that we're going to cover everything in this episode about what he was promoting and campaigning on, but we do want to hit the main points. Casey, maybe people back then had longer attention spans. 12 pages of fine print. That's amazing.
Yeah, I don't know. I looked this up. I do have like a facsimile of this that I bought in Nauvoo.
Yeah.
And you can, of course, look it up on the Joseph Smith Papers site. But man, it is a lot. And maybe we do have shorter attention spans because I read through it and picked up on the main points, but there is a lot of rhetoric in here. And we should mention it's likely that Joseph Smith didn't write everything in here. He had people assisting him like W.W. Phelps
for sure.
and others.
Sure.
So first thing I'll say is that some of the points found in the pamphlet might resonate with some people today. For instance, the pamphlet began with the basic idea that America had drifted from its founding ideals. And Joseph argues that the United States was founded on liberty, equality, and constitutional rights, but had fallen into corruption, inequality, and factionalism. And he praises earlier presidents, especially Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, and Jackson, as models of Republican virtue. So it's kind of a, hey, what are we doing? We've drifted from our founding ideals kind of thing.
And not to put too fine a point on it, but Joseph does not pull any punches when he says that he believed that the decline of our nation began during Martin VanBuren's presidency, which he associates clearly with 1, political corruption, 2, party conflict, 3, economic instability, 4, the failure to protect citizens' rights. Things, of course, which he learned firsthand in his frustrating encounters with Van Buren, right?
Yeah. And the second thing that he repeatedly emphasizes is that government exists to protect the liberties of all citizens, regardless of race or status. He quotes the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to argue that equality should apply universally. One of his central constitutional proposals was giving the president power to use federal troops against mobs or state violence without waiting for the governor to request them. So the proposal, of course, is linked directly to what happened to Latter-day Saints in Missouri, where the state authorities either just tolerated or outright supported anti-Mormon violence.
And maybe the most radical thing about Joseph's presidential platform at the time was how strongly he condemns slavery as absolutely inconsistent with American ideals. And then he didn't just lament slavery. He actually proposed a beautiful solution, which, if this was implemented, would have avoided the Civil War. Just saying. But here's his proposed solution. Number 1, abolish slavery by 1850. How? By purchasing all of the slaves, compensating them financially. How would he do that? He would fund that by selling the public western lands of the United States, and this one's one of my favorites, and by reducing the salary of members of Congress and using that money to help purchase the slaves. And so, of course, that didn't score many points with Congress, but he had already tried that route, and they didn't support him. Yeah. So, but he frames emancipation of the slaves in the United States as both a moral and practical move. He urged slaveholding states to act voluntarily before conflict worsened. Guys, this is 1844. We know what's going to happen in 1861, right? That's the beginning of so much bloodshed. He sees the writing on the wall. You don't have to be a prophet to see the writing on the wall, but he was, and he did. People were noticing, this is a very tense topic, obviously, in the United States, and it culminates in 61 through 65, is it? But he also criticizes some of the politicians who are defending slavery while at the same time claiming to support liberty. He thought that was the biggest hypocritical statement. How could those be true? Both that you're for liberty, but you're pro slavery too. Those don't make sense. And so he just comes right out and just, it's the most vocal Joseph ever is about slavery during this campaign.
Yeah, to a person outside the church, that might be the most notable part about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, is that he's one of the first major candidates actually saying we've got to end slavery or we're going to run into problems. But the next thing that he's in favor of might not be that surprising if you know anything about Joseph Smith's experience in Missouri jails. But he harshly criticizes prisons and penitentiaries, arguing that they failed to reform people and punish the poor unfairly. So he proposes pardoning a lot of prisoners, replacing incarceration with labor on public works, ending imprisonment for debt, and using rehabilitation instead of harsh punishment. So this is kind of his Christian ideals shining through. He famously argues that love conquers all, and that reason and friendship reform people better than confinement. So it's not surprising that he'll take those positions, especially after Liberty Jail and Richmond Jail and some of the experiences he's fresh off of from his time in Missouri.
Yeah, and the next one also isn't surprising, given the church's history with the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society, their bank efforts back in 1837, which was a major factor in the collapse of the church community there and the worst apostasy in the history of the church. So that's the background. But Joseph will advocate for economic reform and the reestablishment of a national bank. He spoke of the need for the creation of, 1, a federally controlled national bank with branches, number 2, in every state and territory, 3, publicly accountable officers, 4, strict limits to prevent corruption and speculation. He believed that this would stabilize the currency in the U.S. It would reduce financial panics, he says. It would curb speculation, and it would help ordinary citizens instead of just the wealthy elites. This is a little different from earlier national bank efforts because Joseph wants it more democratically controlled. That's a key piece. And if a system like this had been in place in 1837, it may very well have softened the impact of the failure of the Kirtland Bank and so many other banks that failed throughout the nation at that time.
Yeah, and we should note that given the context, we've talked a lot about the Kirtland Bank, and hopefully you know a little bit about it. But in context, the Kirtland Bank wasn't the only bank that failed. There were hundreds of banks that failed in what was called the Panic of 1837, which might not have happened or would have been less severe if the federal government had been willing to intervene. Like compare the Great Recession, the 2008 thing, where the federal government intervened and it kind of softened the blows. A lot of bad things still happened. No one's saying they didn't, but the FDIC was able to intervene in a couple of cases. So, all right, the next point is a little surprising, given that the government in Joseph Smith's time was considerably smaller than it is today. But he attacks what he sees as bloated government and career politicians. So one of the things he proposed was, let's reduce the size of Congress. Let's lower congressional salaries so it's not as financially enticing to be a congressman. Let's cut unnecessary offices and expenses. Let's make public officials more accountable. And his tone here is really anti-elitist. He portrays ordinary citizens as morally superior to self-serving politicians. Wonder why he felt that way. But you get where he's coming from. Yeah.
And another topic that was being hotly debated at the time was about Oregon. Should Oregon belong to the U.S.? And what about this idea of manifest destiny, of expanding the United States all the way from sea to shining sea, right, from the west to the east? And here's what Joseph Smith thought about that. He said that Oregon should belong fully to the United States, that Texas should be annexed if it requested admission. It would be their choice. And that even Canada and Mexico were imagined as possible future partners in a larger union. But he also said about that manifest destiny, especially going west, he said only if Native Americans gave their consent should we take those lands and make them part of America, right? And I fantasize sometimes about what the U.S. would have been like if we had asked the Native Americans their permission out west and collaborated with them rather than how they were treated out here. But that's neither here nor there. So Joseph is advocating to combine this with nationalism, and he's going to call for military strength sufficient to defend American commerce and American interests. But unlike later manifest destiny rhetoric, again, he is framing expansion partly as creating broader peace and unity among the peoples that would be affected by this, rather than just bullying them out, right? And so, super, just like you said, his Christian principles are shining through here.
And so let's back up, because those are the main points, and let's kind of look at the overall message of this political tract, which is the best way to kind of understand what he's going for. So it's significant because it shows that Joseph Smith is attempting to move beyond religious leadership into national politics during a time of considerable instability in the United States. And it addresses a lot of the major issues facing the nation in this pre-Civil War period. That includes slavery, that's the big one, but also banking, westward expansion, prison reform, political corruption, and most importantly to the saints, the rights of minority groups. At the same time, the document reveals how profoundly the persecution of the Latter-day Saints influenced Joseph's political views, particularly his belief that the federal government had failed in its responsibility to protect the constitutional rights and freedoms of its citizens. Yeah,
this is clearly growing out of Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints' own experience in America, and it has not been fantastic. They have to intervene to do something. And I think all this, too, raises just a few questions about how Joseph Smith saw his own role in the government as a prophet of God as well, Casey. Like, that's the elephant in the room here, right? In the United States, we have a pretty good tradition of separation of church and state. So let's just say, just for fun, all right, let's just say Joseph Smith won the presidency in 1844. Is he now the president of the United States and the president of the church? Do those mix? To what degree would they mix? To what degree would that be okay in the United States for them to mix? Casey, this was a concern on some. This is one of Joseph's political enemies' favorite points to bring up was, he's going to use all of his religious ideas and he's going to force them upon the American people. Like, what do you think, Casey? What would have happened there?
Yeah. So I mean, the question of church and state is rearing its ugly head, right? And there's a ton to untangle here. But let's start with two key terms that we find often in the discussion surrounding Joseph's presidential run. The first is theodemocracy, and the second is aristarchy. Aristarchy. Okay. It's not a word we use very commonly. Aristarchy. I'm going to go with aristarchy. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. On theodemocracy, I actually have a really good quote from Brother Joseph on this. Here's what he said. He said, "As there is not a nation or dynasty now occupying the earth which acknowledges Almighty God as their lawgiver, I go emphatically, virtuously, and humanely for a theodemocracy." And here's how he defined it: "where God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness." Close quote. That's good. So a place where God and the people hold the power together to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness. So beginning in 1842, Joseph increasingly connected political organization with the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth, this kingdom that Jesus prophesied would eventually come. It's a political kingdom, to be right honest with you, right? Jesus is going to come. The governments of men will end. Christians tell the story this way, and I think it's more or less accurate, right, according to how Scripture explains it, that Jesus will rule and reign over this world as its political leader. And Joseph Smith began increasingly to see that the church was kind of seeding the way for this political kingdom of Christ to eventually unfold here on the earth, right, in the millennial reign of Jesus. And so that's part of what he's talking about here when he says theodemocracy. It's this beginning of inviting God to be a part fully of conducting the affairs of men in righteousness. What that would have looked like exactly, we don't know. We don't know, right? Mm-hmm. But Joseph believed that the kingdom of God that Daniel prophesied of, that would, be set up without hands and would eventually roll forth to fill the whole earth, was not just a spiritual kingdom, but actually a political one. And so there's another angle on why Joseph Smith is interested in politics. But Casey, would that mean he would use the seat of being president of the United States to try to somehow force religion on the people of the U.S.? Like, how would that work?
Yeah, and that might be where we bring in our second term, which is aristarchy. Meaning, this is just a word that means government by good, wise, honest, and excellent people. So rather than emphasizing political parties or popular competition, Joseph taught that society should seek out and sustain morally proven leaders. So loyalty to Zion and demonstrated righteousness were big qualifications for leadership.
Aristarchy is making me think a little bit, maybe this is totally unrelated, but it seems connected. This idea of aristarchy and theodemocracy might be reflected a little bit in the establishment of the Relief Society in Nauvoo in 1842, right? It's maybe a little small scale example of that practice. Like, leaders were selected because of their character. They were excellent. And then they were approved by members through common consent. And they were allowed to continue in their leadership role so long as they remained worthy and effective. Government was based on revelation rather than only a constitutional framework, which Joseph Smith upheld. He upheld the constitutional framework. He just thought we should invite God into the mix a lot more than we were doing.
Yeah. And this is going to sound weird too. Relief Society is a good small scale example of that. But the temple ordinances that were introduced in Nauvoo, including endowment and eternal marriage sealings, had spiritual and political implications. Like, we don't often mix the temple with politics, but while their primary purpose was to bind individuals and families to God eternally, they also prepared a loyal group of leaders who were promised to become kings and priests in God's future kingdom. This kind of illustrates that these ordinances were laying the foundation for an aristarchic, theodemocratic order, that this is what the kingdom of God would look like. Good people being sustained by the people, but ultimately they're accountable to God for what they're doing.
Yeah, and if some people think this is radical, I would say, yeah, it's as radical as the Bible paints the picture that it would be, right? Like, Daniel 7 is maybe the earliest picture of this snapshot, right? Daniel 7, this prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds of glory, meeting the saints when the kingdom of God is going to be fully established on the earth. And then this surprising twist in Daniel 7 is Jesus gives the government of the world over to the saints, and they rule with him. So it's not just him as king ruling alone. It's him as king ruling over kings and priests. He's the King of kings. He's the Lord of the lords. And that's the picture that gets set up biblically, right? And so as radical as this might seem to some sensitivities, right? It's like, well, this is what the scriptures have been prophesying is going to happen. And Joseph saw his role as, what if we can help move this along? Now, I don't know if that is directly connected to his candidacy for U.S. presidency. Would he use that as a way to somehow get religion more into the states and to the people? Like, we don't know, because it never happened, Casey. But to what degree would Joseph have taken his position as president of the church, and how much would that have led into his presidency of the United States? And to what degree would everyone have been okay with that? We don't know, because it never happened. But what we do know is that Joseph did not always separate the true and good universal principles that had been revealed to him and that were in the scriptures and civic affairs. He thought that they were relevant to each other, right? And so he rejected strict party loyalty. He encouraged support for candidates who would promote good order, right? People who would promote things that were consistent with scriptural principles of being a good person and to create an orderly society. In Nauvoo, just for instance, he often helped identify political candidates who he regarded as faithful and capable, after which church members ratified them through voting. This reflected kind of a blend of his prophetic guidance along with popular consent, right? And so he's not fully separating these, and that made some people nervous.
Yeah, that could make some people nervous. And you can actually trace this idea, the development of theodemocracy, through an 1842 article titled "The Government of God." And this sort of explains the theological basis for theodemocracy. It's very rooted in the Bible. He argued that the ancient patriarchs lived under a divine government where God made the laws and chosen leaders administered them in both civil and religious matters. This union of religious and political authority, they believed was going to be restored as part of Zion and the restitution of all things before Christ's millennial reign. So they're looking to the Bible also for models of government that they thought would be more effective.
Yeah, and the practical purpose here, which we don't want to drift too far from, is that throughout 1843, Joseph Smith was emphasizing the importance of using influence to advance what is sound and good, and he kept speaking about the possibility of exercising political power to help protect minority groups like the Latter-day Saints, who had suffered persecution and received little help from government officials. So it is profoundly practical to them, but there's also this really interesting theology and political philosophy that's looming over all of it.
And I guess, we keep coming back to this, but if we're being honest, the big discomfort people might have with Joseph Smith's presidential campaign is this fusion of church and state. Now, the vision never really came true, but would a government like this have favored Latter-day Saints over people of different religious beliefs or people with no religious beliefs at all? Are we setting up a state where one group is favored over all the others?
The very thing we were trying to get away from in England when we came over here and set things up in America the way they are. Yeah. And it's true that we have no way to know exactly how things would have turned out because, spoiler, Joseph did not get elected president. We'll talk more about why. But in principle, right, the design that they were suggesting was for a pluralistic society. That's important. Joseph was very pro-pluralism. For instance, they went out of their way to include non-Latter-day Saints in the Council of 50, which was a group that Joseph Smith had set up to help promote his political career, as well as to establish the kingdom of God on earth. And discourses from this period suggest that he is worried that if freedom of religion wasn't protected for all, right, then other religions would suffer the same kind of persecution that Latter-day Saints had suffered.
Yeah, so he mentions this repeatedly. For instance, in an 1843 discourse, Joseph Smith makes this statement. He says, "If it has been demonstrated that I have been willing to die for a Mormon, I am bold to declare before heaven that I am just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination for the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints, would trample upon the rights of the other denomination, Roman Catholics, or any other denomination who may be too unpopular or too weak to defend themselves. It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole of the human race." So he openly declares, I'm willing to do what I'm doing right now for Latter-day Saints, for Presbyterians, for Baptists, even for Roman Catholics. And at this point in time, Roman Catholics were a very small and despised minority. They experienced significant persecution in the early United States too.
Yeah, and so when we ask the question, what would it have been like if Joseph had been president, and how would other religions have been, put down in favor of Latter-day Saints? We actually know this isn't theoretical, because he was mayor of Nauvoo, and we actually know what policies he put in place relative to other religious groups. This is recorded. There's a resolution that was passed in Nauvoo, for instance, when he was mayor. It says this, quote, "Be it ordained by the city council of the city of Nauvoo that the Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Latter-day Saints, Quakers, Episcopals, Universalists, Unitarians, Mohammedans, that's what they were calling Muslims back then, and all other religious sects and denominations, whatever, shall have free toleration and equal privileges in this city. So I think what was true of Joseph as mayor in Nauvoo would have been true of Joseph as president of the United States overall. Like, that was his position: protect religious pluralism and ensure free exercise of religion for all.
Yeah, it's helpful. We can at least point to his record as mayor of Nauvoo and say, he passed an ordinance saying there would be no religious discrimination. Okay, so, all right. Now we've got to tackle maybe the thorniest question, which is, okay, let's just be blunt. Did Joseph Smith think he could win the presidency? We can look back now with historical hindsight. Again, this is a what if. But if he hadn't been killed in Carthage jail, could he have won the presidency?
Well, the short answer is probably not, as much as I would have loved that. But, I mean, if Joseph had lived through the election of 1844, okay, he basically had no chance of winning a majority of the electoral vote outright. He was an independent candidate, right? He was not a Whig. He was not a Democrat. The political system, the party structure, and his limited national support made that outcome, I would say, extraordinarily unlikely. However, there's some interesting thought from various historians that argue that Joseph Smith's campaign was not as unrealistic as it first appears. Like, under the right circumstances, he might have become a regional spoiler, they would call him, or at least influenced the outcome of the election. Even played a role in a contingent election decided by the House of Representatives. Like, that could have, there's various scenarios that could have played out had he made it to the election because of the popularity of his ideas.
Yeah, and we should emphasize these are all really unlikely, but it seems like there's a couple sources that indicate that Joseph Smith himself did not necessarily envision that he would win through a normal majority vote. Some statements that he made from the time suggested that growing sectional and partisan divisions might result in a kind of electoral deadlock. So under the Constitution, if no candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, the election goes to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation gets one vote. And Joseph may have hoped that the following would happen: that the major parties would split the vote, that he would win enough electoral votes in a few places to become significant, and that he would emerge as a compromise candidate, or maybe a kingmaker, like someone that could really influence who did get chosen. And this was not impossible in theory. I mean, it happened before in the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800 and John Quincy Adams in 1824. Both of those elections ended up in the House. But again, this was real unlikely. Like, I got to be realistic here because he didn't have support from either of the major parties, though he does control an influential voting bloc in the swing state of Illinois. So, yeah, he might have made it in this way, but again, not a high chance of this happening.
Okay, so the most realistic, best case scenario would have been he receives a surprisingly respectable number of votes. He becomes a visible third-party figure. He influences the national conversation. And in an extremely unlikely but constitutionally possible scenario, he helps create an electoral deadlock that sends the election to the House. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And even then, it's difficult to imagine enough members of Congress choosing Joseph Smith over Polk or Clay, to be honest. So I think the bottom line is that Joseph Smith almost certainly would not have become the president in 1844 had he not been killed in Carthage. The political realities, I think, were just stacked pretty heavily against him. But his campaign, I will say this, it was not merely symbolic. He wasn't just a protest candidate, right? He appears to have believed that intense national polarization could create an opening for an independent candidate. That seems clear, right? And while an outright victory is highly improbable, influencing the election or positioning himself as a factor in an electoral deadlock was not beyond the realm of possibility, let's just say.
Yeah, and we should add that just the possibility that he could become president or that he would gain greater political influence through the national exposure that would come from being a presidential candidate seems to have been a factor in his death as well. For instance, here's an interesting account from Stephen Markham, who is a Latter-day Saint contemporary. He's around in Carthage when Joseph Smith is killed. He said, there was a council held in Hamilton's Tavern. That's a tavern in Carthage. Dr. Southwick was in the meeting. This is this guy who Stephen Markham interacts with. He says, seeing what was going on, he said he had the minutes of the meeting, and the purport of said meeting was to take into consideration the best way to stop Joseph and Hiram Smith's career, as Joseph's view on government was widely circulated and took like wildfire. Oh. The leader of the group, so secondhand, he's saying this guy showed him the minutes from a meeting that took place in Hamilton Tavern. The leader of the group said that if Joseph did not get into the presidential chair this election, he would be sure to next. And if Illinois and Missouri would join together to kill them, they would not be brought to justice for it. There were delegates in said meeting from every state in the Union except 3. The governor, this is Thomas Ford, and Captain Smith of the Carthage Grays was in the meeting also. The doctor said the meeting was broken up in a hurried manner, as the Sentinel reported that Colonel Markham was coming upstairs when the meeting dismissed in a hurry. They left the minutes on the table, and the doctor picked them up and brought them to me and read them. So, wow. That's interesting, right? That there was, according to Stephen Markham, like this secretive meeting going on. And what they're primarily worried about is Joseph Smith's political influence, that he was going to gain wide exposure. His ideas would gain wide exposure, and that would cause problems. It's also interesting that according to this, they said that they thought there would be no consequences for killing him, which, I mean, true. There were no consequences for killing Joseph Smith. There was a murder trial held, but nobody was convicted, and basically nothing happened to the people that carried out the murders.
So was there political motivation in the martyrdom of Joseph Smith? Yes. In fact, let me just share a quote from one Dallin H. Oakes. I don't say President Oakes because this is back in 1975, Casey, where then Dallin H. Oakes, not a general authority yet, and his friend Marvin S. Hill, 2 lawyers here, write a book called Carthage Conspiracy, where they go through and analyze the trial of the accused assassins of Joseph Smith. That's part of the subtitle of their book, to try to see what happened with the trial. Were they ever brought to justice for this murder? Anyway, but it's in the midst of that and compiling and going through all of those notes and minutes and documents that Dallin H. Oakes made this conclusion. Here's what he said, quote, "The murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith at Carthage, Illinois, was not a spontaneous, impulsive act by a few personal enemies of the Mormon leaders, but a deliberate political assassination committed or condoned by some of the leading citizens in Hancock County," close quote. Wow. So President Oakes calls this a political assassination. And I think that's right, Casey. I think Joseph Smith doesn't get killed in Carthage jail if he's not running for president of the United States. Do you think that's fair?
I don't know. I think there was also local politics to carry out. The person who's most responsible for the physical act of Joseph Smith's death is Thomas Sharp. And he's downriver in Warsaw, and he really wants Warsaw to kind of become the commercial center of the area. Of course, Nauvoo's growing faster. And with the population in Nauvoo increasing, Thomas Sharp realizes he's not going to be able to win an election without Latter-day Saint support. And so he really turns sour on us when he loses an election to Joseph Smith's brother, William Smith. So I would say local politics play a big role too. And that may have been enough to result in Joseph Smith's death. But were national politics involved? Yeah, absolutely. We'd be naive to say that they weren't involved in Joseph Smith's death. So that's an interesting kind of what if. What if he hadn't ran for president? Would he have ended up in Carthage jail? I'm going to say yeah. I think the Nauvoo Expositor still gets published. I think Thomas Sharp still wants him dead just because of local politics. But the fact that he was running for president seems to have brought in all these other factors too.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the Nauvoo Expositor, right? The newspaper that the enemies of the church publish that really gets everyone whipped up in a lather, and it's going to end up in the court case that leads Joseph and Hiram to go to Carthage jail. In the Nauvoo Expositor, they harp on his national political career, right? They
do.
They really lean into this idea, this fear mongering that Joseph was going to somehow use his position, his ecclesiastical position as a prophet, to really influence America in a way that went against American ideals and values. And so I don't know. Maybe that's a pushback. They're harping on his national political campaign rather than the local politics to.
Yeah, but I mean, they also had other concerns like over plural marriage and Joseph Smith's teachings about God and things like that. Yeah. So I think there was enough animosity there that Joseph could have still gotten to Carthage jail without the presidential campaign. But there's this is all Monday morning quarterbacking, right?
Totally.
We're speculating here. So let me pull it back.
Is it fair enough to say at least this? Joseph Smith is the first U.S. presidential candidate to be assassinated. That's a fact, right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't want some historian to catch us off guard. So I usually say like major factor, like, because I don't know if, random guy 643 said he was going to run for president and got killed. But
okay, wait. I just Googled it. Who was the first U.S. president candidate to be assassinated? Answer from the AI overview. Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, was the first U.S. presidential candidate to be assassinated. He was running as an independent in the 1844 election when he was murdered by a mob at Carthage jail.
Okay.
Boom.
Okay, so it's not hypothetical that he is the first major candidate for president that is assassinated outright. That just happens, right?
That's fair.
But a lot of this stuff about, did his presidential campaign lead to his death is kind of hypothetical. If he hadn't been running for president, we don't know how it would have affected things. My feeling is he probably still would have ended up in Carthage jail, and probably still would have been killed. I don't see significant changes because of that. At the same time, too, it's fun to play around the hypothetical, but I also want to try and capture what Joseph Smith himself felt about this. So did he think he could win? Why was he running? Let me cite a conversation that's not recorded by Joseph Smith. It's actually recorded by Josiah Quincy, this guy who visits Nauvoo in May of 1844, which is just a little over a month before Joseph is killed in Carthage jail. So Josiah Quincy comes from Massachusetts. He brings along with him a man named Charles Francis Adams. Give us a little background on them, Scott, and then we'll dive into this conversation.
Yeah, so both Charles Francis Adams and Josiah Quincy IV here, they came from Massachusetts. And Adams, who was at that time 37, he's a lawyer, probably most well known for being the grandson of President John Adams and the son of former President John Quincy Adams. But he would later build an impressive career of his own, serving in Congress, eventually becoming the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain.
Yeah, and the other person, and the person who actually records the conversation, is Josiah Quincy, who he later writes about this in a book called Figures of the Past from the Leaves of Old Journals, which is published in 1883, nearly 40 years after these events took place. So take that into account. And Quincy wrote about coming to Nauvoo, visiting Joseph and his family in the mansion house. He even mentioned that Lucy Back Smith offered to show them the mummies linked to the Book of Abraham for 25 cents, which is, again, really charming in my mind. This is adorable fun stuff. Yeah. So the account says that the group made their way up the hill to the temple construction site, right? And as they traveled through Nauvoo, Adams and Quincy noticed the deep respect that the city's residents showed to Joseph Smith. Quincy later remarked that if Smith's extraordinary claims sounded like the ravings of a madman, he had at least found an audience willing to believe him. Yeah, that's kind of backhanded compliment, but okay. Yeah. And while they're discussing these weighty topics, Quincy also noted that Joseph shows a lively sense of humor and was often willing to joke about himself. As their carriage rolled through the prairies around Nauvoo, Quincy commented, "It seems to me, General, that you have too much power to be safely trusted to one man." And Joseph immediately fired back, "In your hands or that of any other person, so much power would no doubt be dangerous. I'm the only man in the world whom it would be safe to trust with." And then with a grin, he added, "Remember, I am a prophet."
Oh, man. And one of my favorites, too, is Quincy decides to test his claim of being a prophet. And he said, all right, well, then predict the outcome of the upcoming presidential election. Well, Joseph replied, I will prophesy that John Tyler, who was then the incumbent, will not be the next president. For some things are possible and some things are probable, but Tyler's election is neither the one nor the other.
So, okay.
That's good.
So this,
and he was right. He was right.
Okay. So again, all of this is being filtered through Josiah Quincy. So he kind of paints this picture where the sun starts to set over the Mississippi River and they start to head back to Joseph's house. And then they talk more about politics on the way. For instance, Joseph outlines several ideas from his presidential platform, including reducing the size of the House of Representatives and giving the president greater authority to suppress rebellions without waiting for a governor's request. So he's giving him the Reader's Digest version of what we've been talking about, the pamphlet that we went through.
Yeah, and Quincy says that he found some of Joseph's proposals thoughtful and pretty practical, while others, he said, struck him as unrealistic. But he later wrote that Joseph mixed utopian fallacies with genuinely shrewd suggestions. Interesting. In Quincy's view, Joseph possessed a strong and capable mind, but one that lacked the perspective provided by history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the other things that Quincy recorded that's so important for our purposes here is that Joseph was realistic about his own chances in the election. And he knew that he wouldn't have the backing of a major political party because he had not sought their nomination. Still, he believed the nation's growing political divisions might create an opening. So if neither major party candidate secured a majority of electoral votes, an independent candidate could potentially hold the balance of power. And we should note that according to Quincy, Joseph Smith wasn't predicting his own victory, but he suggested that the idea, that hypothetical, wasn't as far-fetched as some visitors might think.
And so for Adams and Quincy, it was a remarkable day, a great walk with Joseph and a great carriage ride. They spent the night in Nauvoo and boarded a steamboat the next morning to continue north on the Mississippi. As they watched the wooded shoreline drift by, they tried to process what they had experienced. Here's a quote from Quincy. We passed the whole day in his society, speaking of Joseph, and had one of the most extraordinary conversations I ever participated in. He then admitted that he could not fully describe either the beliefs or the character of such an unusual man as Joseph Smith, and he promised to write more about him later. But he was struck by his experience with Joseph.
Yeah, and he does write more about him. I mean, it's decades later, but even after almost 40 years of reflection, Josiah Quincy still struggles to explain Joseph Smith. When he published this memoir, he remained unconvinced that Joseph was a prophet, yet he couldn't ignore the lasting impact that Joseph Smith had made. And Quincy wrote that Joseph Smith may have been a fanatic. He called him an imposter, a possible charlatan, but he also said that such labels didn't necessarily solve the mystery. He noted that countless fanatics and imposters had come and gone, yet few had left behind a movement that continued to shape people's lives long after their deaths. Joseph Smith, Quincy concluded, was not simply someone to criticize, but a phenomenon that demanded explanation.
Yeah, the whole episode is probably best punctuated by that quote. It's such a great quote that he wrote that summarizes his view on the possible legacy of Joseph Smith. I'm sure many of you out there have heard this quote, but it goes like this. It is by no means improbable that some future textbook for the use of generations yet unborn will contain a question something like this. What historical American of the 19th century has exerted the most powerful influence upon the destinies of his countrymen? And it is by no means impossible that the answer to that interrogatory may be thus written, Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. And the reply, absurd as it doubtless seems to most men now living, may be an obvious commonplace to their descendants. Close quote.
Yeah. Yeah,
so that's
interesting
that's
quote,
what Quincy
right?
felt about Joseph Smith.
Yeah. So I mean, like a lot of educated Americans in their time, Quincy and Adams are fascinated by Joseph Smith. They don't accept his religious teachings, and they occasionally poked fun at him in their writings, but their curiosity never really faded. Quincy believed that part of Joseph's appeal came from his unusual balance of confidence and energy and his personal presence. Whatever one thought of his claims, Quincy observed few people had influenced so many hearts and lives as Joseph Smith. So that might give us kind of a snapshot where Joseph, I mean, this is all being filtered through Josiah Quincy, and it's written decades later, but that Joseph was more pragmatic about his presidential campaign, but also optimistic, that he was an optimist. So, I mean...
Well, can I add one thought here?
Yeah.
Just for fun. I went to AI and I copied and pasted that question from Josiah Quincy. What historical American of the 19th century has exerted the most powerful influence upon the destinies of his countrymen? Do you want to know what the answer is, Casey?
From AI.
AI.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Number 1, not Joseph Smith. Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. Yeah. Abraham Lincoln
Number 2,
hadn't really come on the scene yet, so that's fair.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. Number 2, Thomas Edison.
Okay.
Number 3,
Thomas Edison still wasn't around, so that's clear. That's fair.
That's fair. Number 3, Joseph Smith.
Huh.
Number 4, Harriet Tubman.
Okay. Harriet
go.
Tubman really. So we've got 3 people that really hadn't done their thing yet. It's 1844. Yeah. So if we take away the second half of the 19th century, Joseph Smith, Josiah Quincy was on the money.
He was on the money with that question. Anyway, I thought
according
that was fun.
according to AI. All right.
According to AI, so you should punch that question into AI, see if it comes up with the same results. But that's what it just did for me, which was fun.
Well done. All right. So let's try and land the plane here. We've covered a lot of territory, but let's try to put together the bigger picture. So did Joseph Smith's campaign for president matter? Did it have an impact? Well, I'm going to start by arguing that Joseph's 1844 presidential campaign was important not because he had a realistic chance of becoming president, but because it sort of shined a light on the deeper problems of American democracy at the time, especially the failures of the United States to protect the rights of religious minorities. And his campaign kind of serves as a window into the broader issues of religious liberty and political exclusion in 1800s America.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another point related to that is that the experiences of the saints that they had in America had exposed the limits of American religious freedom, right? They pushed it to the test, and it was found wanting. Although the Constitution and state laws had promised religious freedom, governments often failed to protect them. It was failing to protect minority faiths. And so Latter-day Saints suffered violence in America, property loss in America, expulsion, even state-sanctioned threats of extermination in Missouri, right? In Missouri, in the United States of America. And so they had pushed the limits of religious freedom and had come away smarting from that experience, right? Similar prejudice affected Catholics, as you mentioned, and Jews in the U.S. and other minority religious groups. We weren't alone in how we were being treated. And so that's what they learned from firsthand experience, right? Their experience with politics was practical, not theological, right? I mean, it was visceral.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why the saints today have been urged to be informed historically and politically. The federal officials of Joseph Smith's time did not primarily reject Mormon appeals because of Mormon beliefs. Instead, political considerations, especially electoral concerns, like am I going to get elected, and their commitment to states' rights, led national leaders to avoid intervening in these conflicts. Protecting the saints could have been politically costly, seems to have been their main calculus. This happened in part because states' rights often hindered religious equality. Before the Civil War, the Bill of Rights generally did not apply to state governments, and federal courts rarely enforced religious liberty protections against the states. And as a result, state and local majorities could persecute unpopular religious minorities with little federal interference. The Constitution promised freedom of religion, but the federal government in practice did very little to protect that right.
So Joseph Smith felt like he had to act because he saw states' rights as enabling mob violence. He believed the federal government should have authority to protect its own citizens when the states failed to do so. He argued that the government's inability to defend expelled citizens was demonstrably failing their most basic responsibilities. His presidential platform called for stronger federal power to protect such minorities.
We should also emphasize that Joseph Smith advocated religious liberty for everybody, not just Latter-day Saints. He repeatedly stated that he would defend the rights of Presbyterians, Baptists, Catholics, and other faiths just as vigorously as those of Latter-day Saints. And his vision included protection for all religious minorities, and that also included non-Christians.
And we should also mention, just by way of summary here, that his reform platform was broader than religion. Religious freedom was his primary motivation, to be sure. But his campaign, those all 12 pages, tiny print campaign, you can go read it, also includes sweeping political and social reform. He's addressing issues that affected many Americans, not just Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, and this is relevant to us today because the history of the early saints foreshadows later civil rights struggles. So we could compare the effect of states' rights on religious minorities like the Latter-day Saints to the role that was played in preserving slavery and denying rights to African Americans. Both groups suffered because federal authorities declined to intervene against state abuses.
And this is also immediately relevant to Americans even in the 1840s. Like the term Mormonize is going to start to be used as like a word that means the playbook of how you put down a minority group. Seriously, like in 1854, Missouri Senator David Atkinson, he proposed to, quote, Mormonize abolitionists. Oh, what did he mean by that? He meant to use the same combination of mob and militia pressure that had been used against the Latter-day Saints in Missouri against the abolitionists, right? That they had created a successful playbook, and let's use it again now against this different group. And so the successful expulsion of the Latter-day Saints out of Missouri actually becomes a model for how majority groups could deal with other unpopular minority groups. And that's one of the sad consequences of this as well. And by the way, that quote comes from a letter written by Senator Atkinson of Missouri to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis on September 24th, 1854, during the escalating conflict over slavery in Kansas territory. And here's the full quote. He said, "We are organizing. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionists." Close quote.
Yeah. So the meaning of Mormonize was grimly clear to contemporaries. Atchison had participated in the 1838 conflict with the Latter-day Saints, and the term was being used to refer to how we were going to drive out an unwanted group, in this case abolitionists, through a combination of mob violence, intimidation, and organized force. And historians have pointed to the statement as evidence that pro-slavery Missourians consciously viewed the expulsion of Mormons, of Latter-day Saints from Missouri, as a model for dealing with abolitionists in Kansas.
So we would argue that Joseph Smith's presidential campaign remains relevant today. His campaign raises enduring questions, such as, who deserves full citizenship rights? When should the federal government intervene to protect minorities? How do minority groups challenge discrimination embedded in political systems? I mean, Joseph's 1844 presidential campaign shows that achieving true religious freedom requires not just changing hearts and minds, but also reforming the political structures that allow discrimination to persist. It is both systemic and personal, right? It is institutional and it is in the hearts and minds of the people. And Joseph was going for both.
Yeah. So in the end, I mean, Joseph Smith's presidential campaign was fundamentally a campaign for the protection of religious minorities through stronger federal enforcement of civil rights. And even though he doesn't have much of a chance of winning, his candidacy highlights how political structures, especially the states' rights doctrines and electoral calculations, allowed religious persecution to flourish in 19th century America and continues to shape debates about equality and citizenship in our time. So it's super relevant because we still haven't overcome all of these problems. And again, we look to the past to try and learn how to do better in the future.
So in a nutshell, that is an overview of Joseph Smith's run for president of the United States. And again, if you want to go deeper on this, we would definitely point you toward those good resources by Spencer McBride and our friend Derek Sainsbury. And so, but for us, Casey, I think that wraps up what we want to say about that. And next episode, we're off to Utah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the Utah territory. So again, this is going to be episodic, but we hope that the episodes that we've chosen historically illustrate important things about Latter-day Saint interactions in politics, because we're all trying to figure out what to do today and the best way to approach politics in our time and try and be good citizens, but even more importantly, good saints.
More importantly? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, those two things are mutually exclusive, right? So good citizens and good saints. But I think it's more important to be a good saint than a good citizen. That's just me, Scott. You can do your own thing.
Can you be a good saint and not be a good citizen?
Well, what if you live in a country where, being a good citizen means, doing bad things for the state. Being a saint.
Being a good saint would be throwing off a corrupt government.
Yeah, exactly what I said. Okay. Thanks, Scott. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. You're fantastic.
All right. See you next time.
All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.